Presentation overview. Coaching, transitional, and individualized supports provide a framework for academic success, empowering students with learning disabilities to cultivate self-determination and the executive functions required to set and achieve goals in a post-secondary environment. The agenda is as follows. 1. Background of research. 2. Executive functions. 3. Self-determination. 4. Supports examined. 5. The STEPS program. 6. Landmark College support study. 7. The AD coaching model. 8. Outcome of supports. 9. Conclusions and recommendations. And finally, references. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Dietrich, and this is my presentation for the contemporary issues around adults with learning disabilities. It is going to be in PowerPoint. I'm using Zoom right now. And certainly, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So my area of research for the literature review is effectiveness of on-campus supports for students with learning disabilities. So what I was hoping to uncover was, just what's working. What out of the supports that are available on campus, generally speaking, because they're going to differ from campus to campus, university to college, it's fairly similar. But I did just want to ascertain from the research, from what's been done, what's really working for students with learning disabilities, and just sort of an offset of that, what has been carried from high school to the post-secondary environment and what continues to be effective for students with learning disabilities. Some of the articles that I did study were focused on autism, others were strictly learning disabilities, some were ADHD as well as learning disabilities. So you'll see from the references, and I'm going to actually mention the titles of the articles as well. So many services are available. Just a little bit of background. As you're all aware of, within the high school environment, but also, of course, within university and college settings. And as long as a student discloses, brings forth that information from their IEP to an accessibility officer or a counselor, whatever they may be named, they can actually take advantage of supports within the post-secondary environment. And there's steps to do that. I mean, meeting with the counselor and various other aspects of that assessment process to ensure that those supports are right for that student. And we have many students, thousands, taking advantage each semester, and that's out of the students that disclose. There may be students, of course, if there always are, that aren't going to disclose, but out of the students that do take advantage, there are thousands each semester across North America that take advantage. Across Canada, we can certainly limit it to Canada, but these studies, as you'll see, are primarily American studies. So as I mentioned, my thesis was from the myriad of supports, what's working, what processes, interventions, techniques demonstrate the greatest promise for assisting students with transitioning into the new environment and achieving their academic goals. So as we've seen through the course, executive functions and self-determination, those areas are huge areas because as we'll see, they really form the primary source for those students to build off of with respect to being able to function in an academic environment and a challenging one. I mean, they come from the high school environment, but they're going to be, certainly a lot more expected of them with respect to organization and meeting deadlines and all of the rest that we all know and understand comes with being in a post-secondary environment. So cultivation of these key areas, the executive functions, and ensuring that motivation is there will certainly pave the way for academic success for students with learning disabilities. So just a quick recap, because we've looked at executive functions through the course. It covers things like impulse control. Okay, so stopping to think before acting, not immediately just acting on one's emotions. So emotional intelligence, and we've heard that term before, EI. And that's really all about becoming more self-aware. Flexibility, and that's something we really need to be able to do to actually function well in a post-secondary environment, because things do change, and we have to learn to adapt. Our working memory, so that ability to hold information in your mind and use it to complete a task. And there are skills certainly that we can utilize to improve our working memory. Excuse me. Self-monitoring, the ability to monitor and evaluate your own performance. And this is really linking into the metacognitive areas, thinking about your thinking, which is so important, that reflective piece that enables us to really see where we're doing well with respect to our learning, and what techniques we're employing to do our work, and what isn't working. You know, what really worked, you know, with respect to the last assignment that I completed. You know, how was I able to do it so well, and what really impeded my ability to do better? Analyzing those so that moving forward, we can put into place those best practices that are going to ensure our success, and certainly save us time as well in the future. When we have so many competing deadlines. Planning and setting priorities, so that time management piece, and goal setting is part of that. Goal setting is huge. Ensuring you're using those you know, resources that we have at our fingertips, many of them, those assistive technologies, you know, that can help students with learning disabilities, but also just basic technologies, you know, using your reminders on your phone, or, you know, through Outlook, to ensure that you're not missing something that's due, or missing an exam or test. And then getting starting something and fighting the urge to procrastinate, putting in place, and we all procrastinate from time to time, but learning when it's happening, why it's happening, taking away those things that are causing us to procrastinate. And there are so many of them that fight for our attention every day, but putting into place those strategies, again, that are going to make us barrier free with respect to what we need to get done. And again, the organization piece, you know, making sure that, because it certainly does bring stress into our lives when we're not organized. And, you know, there's bits of paper and bad temper everywhere when we're not actually really being consciously aware of what needs to be done, where things are, and having, again, a goal and a set of you know, a set of organized tasks to complete each day, each week, each month. So self-determination theory, think motivation. And I'm using SDT here because we have external motivators, and they can be in the form of grades or evaluations. For example, these are just examples, but we also have our own internal motivators. And they could be just interest, you know, you're interested in something, so that motivates you. Or you really care about something, you care, you know, it could be a social issue, you know, something that you really, you know, you want to get behind, and you want to see, you know, social change. That could be it, or your value system. So we're motivated by both the external and the internal, or the intrinsic factors. And it's certainly a mix of the two, but we need to have those, you know, as part of our being, you know, when we're moving into areas like academics, because if we're not motivated by something, then it's going to make us very, you know, ill at ease with actually approaching all of these other areas, and you know, with respect to creating those factors such as the executive functions and self-regulation that are going to enable us to be successful. If we don't really want to do it, it's going to be pretty hard for us to work on those skills to actually accomplish our tasks. So, so supports examined. So the STEPS program, White et al. So the title of that article is Development of a College Transition and Support Program for Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder. I explored another study, Landmark College Support Study, excuse me, that was DuPaul et al. And that was college supports with ADHD and LD. So the effects of support services on academic performance. And that's a correlation between, academic performance in the form of a GPA and what supports actually affected the best results with respect to the GPA. And then the final study that I chose to, as part of my research was executive function coaching for college students with learning disabilities and ADHD. And that was a new approach for fostering self-determination. So it really tied everything in and gave a really good solid overview of the executive function piece, the self-determination piece, cultivation of those areas, and what it looked like in a real post-secondary environment. And that was the AD coaching model. So that coaching model, as we'll see, is extremely successful in post-secondary environments. So STEPS stands for Stepped Transition and Education Program for Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder. And really, this was a transition program from high school. So I wanted to study this just to see what, an example of what was out there with respect to high school, because we see so often how important it is to set students up for success right at the high school level. But also, of course, these transitional strategies can be put into place in the post-secondary environment, of course, continued strategies. So it's not as if, okay, you've developed all those transition strategies, now you're in post-secondary, just use them now. We have to ensure that we're actually continuing to provide those supports for students. So the STEPS program's aim was to improve both self-regulation and self-determination. And self-regulation, you can think certainly of, the executive functions through a process of teaching effective stress management techniques, training in problem solving and goal setting, and experiential opportunities related to the students' identified goals. And of course, when we think experientially, we also think of the reflective piece, so reflecting on our learning. So here's the diagram, of the STEPS model. So step one, there was an assessment, psychoeducation. And for those of you not familiar with the term, and I wanted to ensure that I was, up to date with exactly what it meant. It helps people better understand and become accustomed to living with mental health conditions or conditions that, may present barriers to learning. And it's a one-on-one, it's a talk type therapy. And it's really coming to terms with challenges, how to cope, knowledge of what you're able to do, what you're able to bring to the table, and what you need to do in order to improve your coping abilities through times of real stress and strife in some cases. They address difficulties. If the students understand, they have the skills to do that, they're more in control and have a greater sense of emotional and mental well-being. So identifying those deficits for remediation, being very, very aware of what it is. And we spoke about this a lot in the class. Those students have to be aware, of exactly what they're dealing with so that they can advocate, for themselves, and they can also ask when they need to ask for the supports that they need to be successful. Because again, it's about leveling that playing field. And the family is very, very actively involved in the STEPS model in step one. Step two, not so much. That's facilitating the transition and that social integration, the social piece, dealing with all of those emotional factors, and the life skills coaching, the identifying and securing appropriate services, that advocating again. So key features, it was individualized and person-centered core content modules for each phase that I just described or just went through there. Implementation is flexible because sometimes things change, as we know, with different programs. And it's based on a cognitive behavioral approach. So helping an individual becoming more aware of inaccurate or negative thinking. So that positive self-talk that we've heard, those positive affirmations, is so important. And the completion between 12 to 16 weeks. So that's your typical semester length. So one-on-one coaching supports. So the STEPS program provided for an ongoing connection with a counselor, ongoing one-on-one, one counselor for that student. So it was consistent. And, there was monitoring, there was positive feedback being presented, and certainly, of course, encouragement with respect to modifying potentially strategies to help that student improve, navigating identified goals, and and those students were pretty much connected, via every method you can think of. So texts, and emails, calls. So very, very much a one-on-one. Now, Landmark College Support Study, it was developed to address questions regarding the effect of support services on the GPA directly. And that's something that I came across. One thing that was predominantly kept, being stated was that there's not enough research on what supports are successful, as per the final GPA. So something that, is really definitely something that we need to look at, studying more. So definitely a deficit out there with respect to research. But this study did do that. So it actually correlated the effectiveness of the supports, primary qualitative approaches, with the achieved GPA. And these areas certainly, over a 5-year period, gave us a really good indicator through this article of just how effective supports were. So 3 supports were really studied closely: tutoring, so students could participate in one-on-one or small group tutoring; coaching, there's certified coaching staff; one-on-one approach; metacognitive thinking was a huge part of the coaching piece; and academic devising. So weekly academic advising sessions. And again, that reflection piece was implicit in the academic advising as well. And the key features here, Landmark College, and maybe some of you might have heard of it, is actually a higher institution that serves strictly students with learning disabilities and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, specifically ADHD. So this is really, it was interesting for me to look at this study because, perfect controls were in place to really evaluate, these particular supports. And Landmark, it was people who worked at Landmark were also popping up in other research studies that I was looking at. So so it was really interesting to see these individuals. Obviously, they know how to work with students with learning disabilities. Their supports are obviously going to be very, very focused on learning disabilities, the pure supports, because they were created with a view to these students specifically in this academic environment. Really, those, if you think of any other institution, it's going to pale in comparison to the supports. You're just looking at it theoretically because you don't have the staff that's trained and dedicated to providing supports just for students with LDs and ADHD, autism. So the study took place over a 6-year period, and approximately 2,000 students, 5 to 6 year period, 2,000 students examined to what extent was student semester GPA correlated to provision of academic tutoring, coaching, and advising supports. And the AD coaching model is our next area that I wanted to, and I'm going to talk about the outcomes of those studies in just a second. But it's a targeted service, and this was the third study that I went through. Targeted service for students that seeks to improve the executive functions through the utilization of specific questions that encourage reflective thought processes. So again, that metacognitive piece, that was the primary focus of this. So those questions asking students, okay, how was your coaching? And you'll see there's actually 3 questions that were specifically asked. So largely qualitative data in this case. And the executive function coaching provides support for the development of skills, strategies, and beliefs needed specifically to manage those executive functions. And the coaches view students as creative and resourceful while helping them to learn how to take action to accomplish goals. So it's not as if, okay, well, here's the strategies, go to it. They're definitely, intrinsically, as many mental health supports, posit, the most important and critical component is that individual is part of the process and part of the planning process. They have to be invested in it from the inception phase. So key features of AD coaching: study involving 54 students diagnosed with various learning disabilities. And the questions posed included, why do students try and then persist or not persist to use coaching? How do students compare coaching to other support services? And what benefits or limitations do they see with coaching services? So outcomes of supports, the general overarching outcomes: preliminary data for the STEPS program that I discussed, and it's still ongoing. So that is a program that's still being monitored and still progressing. It is achieving favorable results overall. The qualitative data is illustrating that students are learning how to control their emotions, and they're learning how to integrate those all-important goal-setting strategies as well. The landmark college support study, results of this study indicated that of the 3 student support variables, coaching reached the level of statistical significance for overall sample. But coaching and tutoring were very close, but overall the coaching piece seemed to be predominantly the most successful strategy that was incorporated for students. And the ad coaching model, upon conclusion of the study, the students claimed that the coaching, again, enhanced their self-awareness about the impact of their executive function challenges and helped them develop new skills for overcoming these functional limitations. So in conclusion, some overarching themes here that I came across: the need for individual support. So as opposed, and it really makes sense, because as we've learned through the course, each individual with an LD faces their own unique challenges, and no support is one size fits all. We need those one-on-one supports that are individual and customized to each student. And we have to ensure that that student with a learning disability connects with those resources immediately, so that that transition from high school to college is seamless, and they don't lose time, because with losing time, the stress encroaches upon them, and then it becomes difficult for them, much more difficult than it would normally be. And so the conclusion, and just a few areas here from the research, and the LDAO states that many students with LDs have difficulty with executive functions, as well as students with LDHD, and there's a targeted need, as per DePaul et al., for targeted services that address these key areas. The need for schools to go beyond providing general support services. Okay, and this is important because we see a lot of generalized services out there. They need to provide targeted interventions depending on the student's needs. And that's DePaul again. And finally, DePaul et al. Stated that although students can benefit to some extent from a variety, it is those services, again, that directly address a student's primary area of challenge. Now, coaching and the cultivation of self-determination and executive function. So another key overarching theme across these articles. It really, these articles demonstrated to me the bond that's forged between the student and the coach. It's powerful. It's very, it's accountability, but it's also, it's definitely a relationship building process for the student. The fact that they can bounce things off of that individual, they know they can go to them at any time, really important and helpful for students. And again, it makes sense that it would be, to have someone there that's available, that knows your situation so intimately, and that you can speak with on a regular basis. So it strengthens the student's resolve, and it becomes, a large motivator for that student to really focus on improving those executive functions and setting goals and achieving those goals. So just a few areas, and this was the largest area that I came across. The greatest amount of information, the greatest correlations were to be found with the coaching and executive functions piece. Those going hand in hand. The self-determination, of course, is built in there too, because when students are developing those executive functions, that precursor is certainly that they have that determination, that self-determination, that ability to want to advocate for themselves and to and are motivated by both external and internal factors. At that point, they have more faith in themselves, more confidence in themselves moving forward. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's quite a few different sections, but feel free to certainly go through all of them. Because there's DePaul, and all of the articles actually spoke to this. So for example, the focus of executive function coaching has shifted. It's moved away from a model intent on supporting immediate performance by setting and enforcing mileposts and goals for students that model that in a model that fosters student autonomy, self-determination, and metacognitive awareness. So again, the coaching model is really the driving force behind creating, the perfect climate for students to develop that autonomy, that self-determination. And that metacognitive awareness, again, that is so very important for students to move forward and to develop the strategies that's going to make them a successful student. And coaching in contrast to tutoring, largely, I mean, because depending on the tutoring approach, but coaching does address those executive functions a little more directly. And that was the study with the ADHD. Primarily, you were seeing a huge leap in the executive functions being developed for students with ADHD. And students also reported that in contrast to traditional campus supports, coaching focused primarily on supporting their emerging autonomy. Again, a relationship between self-determination and positive outcomes. Parker and Boutel. Parker and Boutel again underscore that college support services should promote the self-determination of students with disabilities. So they are engaging in that goal-directed, self-regulated, autonomous behavior. And students who have a knowledge of their own strengths and limitations, and again, it's that self-awareness. That's going to help them, experience that success personally and certainly into their college and their working lives ultimately. Now, one thing I did last term, and I just wanted to briefly mention, is I took the instructional techniques prior to this course, and throughout that opportunity, I took advantage of doing more research there, and I came across all of these things, in the research for my final assignment. So the psychological techniques such as positive thinking and visualization and attentional control and goal setting, those executive functions, they work to refocus our mental energies, to construct positive internal messaging, and to create more successful outcomes. So I did link to the actual module that I created to address those areas. If you're interested in looking at it, it's in the references section. But this all was culminating for me because in completing that module and then seeing just how important and integral it is as part of the executive function development. It's wonderful when those kind of things coalesce and you can see, the correlations between your research from course to course. The transitional supports, transitioning to a new and unfamiliar learning space, obviously extremely jarring for any of us, but especially those students, of course, that do have to contend with a learning disability. So the efficacy of those transitional supports, tremendous role in whether they're successful or not. And the transitional piece that's why it's an overarching theme, come up quite a bit throughout these 3 articles and the additional articles that I looked through. But programming that provides for that smooth transition and then picking up in the post-secondary environment, so imperative. And certainly the ongoing LD support has to be in line with what they were receiving in the high school area, so that they can continue to be successful, and they have to know that those services are there and connect to them right away. But again, those particular transition supports should be started at the high school level prior to them coming into the post-secondary environment for them to certainly be more effective. My references are here. And again, if any of you have any questions, I welcome them, and I look forward to listening and viewing presentations of all of you. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.